Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
You meet someone online and there's this instant connection. It's amazing how much the two of you just seem to click. They live somewhere far away and there's some plausible reason they can't travel to meet you. They tell you they're in love with you and you feel optimistic for the first time in a long time. They have a successful career, yet somehow they need money from you to solve a short-term problem, always with the promise of paying you back. Time goes on and they need more money more urgently. You've started to see the cracks and begin to wonder whether they've been lying this whole time. All of a sudden it hits you. You've been scammed. Fool Me Twice is the story of my mother, Jules Hannaford, a woman who was drawn into the dangerous world of sweetheart scams. After a trip overseas to meet a stranger, a dangerous altercation in a Manchester hotel room, and thousands of pounds lost for good, she's here to tell her story. Fool Me Twice, a true crime podcast, is available on Apple Podcasts, Ozcast Network, and anywhere you listen to your podcasts.
Today I'm here with Bentia Perch. Hi Benita, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Benita, how did you find yourself in Hong Kong?
An interesting sort of process. My father, he has lived in Asia for about 30 years and in Hong Kong for about 20 years. And after I finished medical school in the US, I decided to go back to South Africa. I started dating an old friend of mine and we ended up getting married. And my dad was like, do you want to come to Hong Kong? And for him to come work for him. So we were like, you know what? Why not? We're young. We didn't have kids. Future of South Africa is a bit dicey. And so we decided to come to Hong Kong. And that's the story of how we got there.
What were you like as a child?
I was one of those people who I kind of knew from age 3 what I was going to do with my life. It was a very clear pathway. Like I wanted to be a doctor from the year dot. Like that's what I liked to do. That's where my interest was. I did biology at school. I was quite a sickly child though, which was part of probably my interest as well. I was quite shy. I've always been a bit of a nerdy person as well, but sporty as well. I did like dance and running, but I've always been a super academic, super interested in the way the world works, people work, the way the body works. I feel like my path is very much what I was meant to do from a very young age. Like in grade, I was maybe 10 or 11 and I have an interest in herbal medicine. And that's what I want to do for a school project. Like that might be a bit different to the norm. And I've always been a super spiritual person. My mom's very spiritual. So I've always looked at things even from quite a young age. There's a bigger piece going on in the world as well. So I think I probably realized, probably even from like age 9 or 10, that I just kind of saw things maybe a little bit different to what everybody else did.
What do you do now?
I'm a naturopathic doctor. Basically, what that means is I did my undergrad in sort of pre-med and nutrition. And my plan was always actually to go to medical school. But along the way, I just realized like I resonated with something different and I was taking some time off and I was working in a pharmacy in South Africa. And I picked up a book and I started to read this book and it was all about like herbal medicines and using some other things. And I was like, who's written this book? I'm like, this is exactly what I want to do. And I saw the author and I was like, he's a naturopathic physician. And I was like, okay. So I started to research what that was. And I was like, boom, this is what I meant to do with my life. So when I finished my nutrition degree in the UK, I went to naturopathic medical school in the US. And basically, as a naturopathic physician, especially the way that we trained in the US, you have to do your 4-year undergrad and then you do 4 years of medical school. And my first 2 years very similar in the sense of or the anatomy and the biochemistry, etc., etc. But we're completely different is in our philosophy and in our treatment. So we're always looking for the why. What's the cause? What's going on? What's the reason that things are sort of out of balance? And we're always looking also to bring the body back into balance as opposed to just suppressing symptoms, which our conventional counterparts tend to do. And then we treat using a combination of homeopathy, Western herbal medicines, supplementation, nutrition changes, lifestyle changes. And we also tend to use things like functional medicine testing, which I can explain a little bit more about, as well as looking at regular blood work, both from a pathological perspective, but also for what should be optimal, which is very different from what the sort of medical profession look at. It's a very, what we call holistic or totality approach to treating the human being.
Tell me a little bit more about what is functional medicine.
Functional medicine is like bastardized naturopathic medicine. It's basically when the medical doctors cottoned on to the fact that maybe what we were doing was kind of interesting. They had to kind of come up with a term of they're not going to ever be naturopaths. So they had to kind of come up with a term of what do medical doctors or chiropractors or other people who are interested in this type of medicine call themselves? And that term became functional medicine. People like Jeffrey Bland and Alan Gaby, who were kind of the founders in the US, but most of them worked in the trenches with the old school naturopathic doctors. So that's where the ideas kind of came from. So they're quite similar. I would say the difference is because functional medicine tends to be often practiced by like medical doctors or chiros, they tend to use parts of it. Yes, they're looking for the cause and the testing and the way they supplement, but they tend to still be quite protocol based. Where I think as a naturopathic physician, we use functional medicine all the time with our testing, but we're still a little bit more unique in the way that we look at the individual in front of us. And we probably tend to use a little bit more herbs and homeopathy than our functional medicine counterparts who tend to use more supplements and products that are developed by companies, and then they're kind of following protocols based on what testing shows. But most naturopathic physicians or naturopaths use a lot of functional medicine in their approach.
Tell me a bit about your experience with chronic fatigue syndrome.
I grew up in South Africa my whole life in Cape Town. And at 18, I decided to go off to the US to my undergrad education. And I got into a really good school. I mean, as I told you, I was always a little bit nerdy, but I chose to go to a school in the snow in, Hanover, New Hampshire in the US. So you're talking about I had a very easy, comfortable upbringing in Cape Town, very warm. And off I went to sort of an Ivy League school on my own into the freezing cold. And it probably wasn't the best choice of university, though the people I met there are still some of my best friends in the world. And it was actually too much for my body. So the freezing cold winters, and I pushed myself. I did track, I did science project on top of my pre-med classes, and I ended up getting really ill. What's very interesting now that I know, I've done a lot of studying in mold toxicity because it's a big issue in Hong Kong. And I realize now, looking back, at the time, they just kind of diagnosed me as chronic fatigue. I kind of took a year off. I saw an infectious disease specialist in South Africa. He figured out what I was. And then I ended up going to finish my undergrad in the UK. But with the knowledge I have now, Dartmouth is a very, very old campus. And it's a very moldy campus because it's been around for hundreds of years. And I realize now that I actually had mold toxicity years later, because what was interesting is I actually left the campus, got much better, and decided to come back after a few months because, my friends and my boyfriend at the time were there. And I ended up getting very, very sick again. And that's when I left for good. And from the moment I left there until now, it took me about 6 months to a year to really recover. And then I've just been better and better since then and never had the same problems again.
Did you say you had multi-toxicity?
Mold, yeah, from toxic mold.
Oh, mold, sorry. Oh, so you think you got mold toxicity at uni?
But I've only realized that in the last few years when I started to really understand mold toxicity, because I treat it so much in Hong Kong, because it's a big issue in Hong Kong, right? Because people are living in moldy homes and then they end up with all these weird symptoms and no one can figure out what's wrong with them. And then they get put on antidepressants because everyone just tells them they're crazy, but they're not. And so I realize now that that is probably likely what happened. But at the time, we just didn't know. Like, I was this healthy, super vibrant person who kind of whole body kind of fell apart. And then very interesting. And at the time, I ended up seeing an infectious disease specialist diagnosed me. And then I ended up seeing a medical doctor who was a little bit alternative. And he did this whole like immune globulin protocol and IV therapy. And, I'm Jewish. My mom's a very kind of Jewish mom. She's going to fix her daughter. Took me to like a homeopath at the time. And they treated me. And so it was really the type of medicine that I ended up doing that got me better, because the medical profession were like, well, this is what's wrong with you, but there's nothing we can do to help you. And it was really through alternative medicine that I got better. And then, as I said, I went off to London, did my undergrad, went off to medical school, and really have recovered well. Like now, if you look, most people will be like, how could you have ever had chronic fatigue syndrome? Because I live a life that's kind of more manic than most people's lives.
How long were you sick for?
I was really sick for about a year. I went a year to my undergrad, then I kind of took time off and I went back for about a year. And the end of that year, I was really, really sick when I came back to South Africa, to a point where like I couldn't even walk up the stairs. My mom lived in like a duplex. I couldn't walk up the full set of stairs. I had to walk up halfway, sit down. Like if I think now, I can't even imagine how it was like that, where I went to university in Cape Town for a little bit and I had to get a special parking because I couldn't walk the distance from where I had to park my car in the normal parking lot to get to the lecture hall.
Oh my gosh.
I know. I was 19 years old. I was an athlete and a dancer. So you can imagine like your whole world falling apart on you.
Yeah, that's crazy. You mentioned that you overcame the condition using natural medicines. Did you try conventional medicine first?
As I said, I saw an infectious disease specialist at sort of a top hospital, and he kind of said, this is what's wrong with you. Go lie down and relax, basically. He didn't have anything to offer me to get better. So that's when my mom especially, we just started to explore every opportunity, like everything that was available in Cape Town at the time to get me better.
What did you use? Did you use naturopathy at the time?
Kind of, in the sense of, because there's no sort of naturopathic doctors in South Africa. We didn't know what that was. There is kind of now, but not in the same way that sort of the way we trained in the US. So I saw a medical doctor who was very open-minded, and he did some injections of immunoglobulins and nutrients and things like that, which made a big difference. And then I also saw sort of a homeopath who did sort of some homeopathy. And then I made major changes to my diet. I did a greens powder every day. I completely changed what I ate. I gave up dairy. So it was a combination of all those things. So I was actually doing, which is what I now know is naturopathic medicine, but I didn't have access to that. I wish I had.
Yeah.
Like, I just feel if I'd known when I first got sick, if I'd had access to someone like me, I may have been able to figure out what was wrong and finish my undergrad in the US. But it also is what led me to do what I'm doing today.
What were you studying in your undergrad?
I was just pre-med. I was just going to go to regular medical school.
Was it because of this chronic fatigue syndrome that you moved into naturopathy?
I would say definitely, yeah. It was what kind of made me realize, oh, wait a minute, there's something else. And actually, when I found out about naturopathic medicine, it resonated with me straight away. I was like, that's what I'm meant to do with my life.
I'm really curious to learn a little bit more about how mold can impact your life, because we do live in a very, very moldy climate here. Tell me a bit more about it.
Yeah, it will freak you. And like, honestly, so
yeah, I'm really interested. I'm wondering if I'm having any effects like with my sleep and stuff like that. I don't sleep well.
Oh yeah, mold massively affects sleep. So basically, mold's effects on the body. So not everybody will be affected by mold, which is also what's interesting, because it all depends on how good a detoxer you are or not. So some people can live in quite a toxic environment and be okay. Other people can just sniff something and things fall apart. So the obvious symptoms that you notice will be allergies, eczema. So some of my worst eczema cases are mold cases. Chronic allergies that just don't respond to anything. So those are sort of some of the very obvious things, but also neurological complaints massively start to be affected. Depression, anxiety, insomnia. It's almost like, because you imagine your body's always like on high alert fighting something. So it goes into a state of overdrive. Endocrine system, mold is very much a disruptor of hormones. The big one, and then gut function too. So like gut overgrowth is like yeast and mold toxicity are a big one too. And then the thing obviously we worry about the most long-term with mold is cancer, because mold is a massive suppressor of the immune system and messer of the immune system. So also people who are chronically ill all the time as well, mold is something to think about. It is massive. Basically now, every time I have a difficult case that is not responding the way they should be, because someone's got some allergies or someone's got, and you give them a homeopathic remedy and you change their diet and you give them some fish oils and a multi and boom, they're good to go, right? But then I have some of these cases where you do all the sort of obvious stuff that most people respond to and they just don't get better. And every single one of them so far that I've tested has had mold toxicity. It's sort of like universal. I have not had one so far that I'm like, oh, you're not mold toxic.
Wow, that is amazing. I didn't even realize that it could have such a huge impact. And have you met other people who have literally got chronic fatigue from mold as well?
Yeah, that was the obvious one that I missed out of saying of the big symptom of mold is chronic fatigue.
Right, yes. Okay.
Because it
chronic
messes
fatigue,
with
yeah.
the toxins from mold really affect our mitochondria. I don't know how much cell biology you know, but the mitochondria is what makes our energy and our ATP. So mold massively affects the mitochondria. So one of the big symptoms is chronic fatigue.
Also believe that you suffered from asthma as well. Is that right? And will you overcome that through naturopathy?
Yes. So basically, the asthma I kind of had throughout my 20s, even after I recovered from the chronic fatigue. When I started naturopathic school, I was on 5 medications to keep my asthma under control. And I started to see a naturopathic doctor my first year, and she started to make changes. One of the big ones was really changing my diet, removing dairy completely, really increasing veggies. At that time, I didn't remove gluten. I have now. And then she started to really treat my gut and heal my gut. And so slowly but surely, I was able to come off certain medications. And then in my 3rd year, I really fell in love with homeopathy, which a lot of people are like, placebo, crap. Like, I have an incredibly scientific brain. Homeopathy is to get the right remedy is an incredibly scientific process. And I started to get treated by homeopathy. And it was truly that, together with the diet and the gut healing, that got me off it. And by the time I finished my residency, I was completely off all my medication. And to this day, which was 12 years ago now, to this day, I have stayed completely off all asthma medications. I'm symptom-free. I lived in Hong Kong, like a massively polluted environment. Granted, I have the air purifiers and I am dairy and gluten-free, but that's all to do with just sort of the treatment and the homeopathy I did along the way. And I suffered till 28. I was like massively suffered with asthma.
That's quite amazing. Tell me what the benefits are of being dairy and gluten-free.
It's very much all individual. For me, dairy, like just mucus, I have dairy. I can literally tell when I've been dairied accidentally. You know, at restaurants, they put butter in something. Literally, I start to straight away get mucus in both my nose. I'm quite good at quickly clearing it out. But if I didn't, let's say I decided to just go on a dairy binge for 3 or 4 days, then I would probably start to cough and notice that I have mucus very, very quickly. Gluten for me is more subtle. Gluten doesn't so much cause my asthma, but it causes my sinuses to get quite blocked. And it very much affects my energy level and my concentration. So if I have gluten, which occasionally, you know, if I go for dinner, I'm not like uber strict because I'm healthy enough that I can kind of cheat a little bit. But then the next day I'll notice, oh, I'm a little bit more sluggish. I'm not quite as sharp as I normally would be. But that's how it affects me. Basically, a food intolerance, if you have it, will cause inflammation in the body. And wherever you have a weakness in your body, that's where it will creep up. So for some of my patients, if it's joint pain, for other people, it's gut issues. For other people, it's depression. Like for every person, it can present in a slightly different way.
How has your life changed since you've overcome both of these illnesses?
I thrive because my whole life I'd always suffered from asthma. So it was always this big, not limit. I mean, I was a runner and a dancer, but I always lacked a little bit of stamina compared to sort of my peers. And even with energy wise, it was good. So both things were sort of always there as weaknesses. And overcoming them has allowed me, I'm actually stronger and do more exercise at this stage in my life than I did when I was younger. And I have the stamina to kind of go hiking. And I did the Inca Trail. Like that would have been unimaginable when I was younger because I just wouldn't have had the air to be able to do that. And I work, you know, like I'm a mom of 2 little boys. I work full time. I run a practice. I do all sorts of things. And everyone's like, how do you manage it? And I'm like, well, granted, I do sleep a lot and I don't drink a lot. I'm dairy and gluten free. I do a lot to look after myself. But a lot of it is from the naturopathic medicine and the meds and the supplements that I use that I can do what I do.
Oh, that's amazing. That's so inspiring. Why do you think it's important for people to focus on their well-being?
I just spent the weekend. My father is somebody who has lived a very different life to me. His attitude has been, I'm going to live my life. He's very overweight and he's got type 2 diabetes. And it's suddenly in his 70s have all caught up with him. And he's recently had to have surgery, like an angiogram, and he had to have a stent put in. And he's ended up with this really bad infection in his back. And because he's diabetic, his body can't fight the infection. And so I spent this past weekend in Bangkok. I'm actually living in Phuket at the moment because we've moved here and I'm meant to be commuting. That's a whole different story. But watching him suffer, like he was in so much pain. They can't go and do a biopsy like they normally would because he's had the stent put in. His body doesn't fight an infection because of diabetes. He's kind of talking about, oh, take me to Switzerland. If this pain doesn't go away, like I can't live like this. And it just made me go, wow, even more so, I love what I do and I'm so lucky to do what I do. But I'm like, oh, it's so important that people look after themselves because you don't think about suffering when you're 20 or 30, right? Or even 40, that this is where you could end up if you don't look after himself. And he's even for the first time saying to me today, speaking to him on the phone, thank God he is doing a little bit better this week. And he's like, yes, I'm changing my priorities. I need to really focus on being healthy and not. And I'm like, great. But if you'd done this 20 years ago, you wouldn't be in this position that you're in right now, right? And he can't get insured because he's got all these pre-existing conditions. And it's such a difference. And I just think also, like, I treat a lot of kids, which I love treating children because I'm like, if I can find out if someone is 3 years old, doesn't do well with dairy, and I can figure out a homeopathic remedy that can help them deal with their anxiety and live a better life. Oh my God, the difference to go through life with some of the things that people just deal with on a day-to-day basis. If you can help someone at 3 and 4, they're just going to thrive, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
For me, it's so important, but it is a choice. Like I have this conversation with a lot of my patients all the time. I'm like, for every benefit, there's something you might have to sacrifice. And everyone has to weigh up what they're prepared to do, right? And we're all different and there's no judgment in that.
Yeah.
Not everybody wants to change their diet. They don't want to give things up. They're like, life's too short to do it. What's interesting is the people who have cancer, the people who have crippling autoimmune disease, it's amazing when people are very sick, what they're prepared to do. But if they're not that sick, they're not prepared to really make change in their lives. And that always fascinates me and saddens me as well, because I'm like, if you'd made those changes earlier.
Yeah, you've got to, it's like getting to the worst case scenario before you'll take action. Rather, it's like preventative medicine, isn't it? Rather than doing it once you're in trouble. What's the benefit of doing things the natural way rather than the conventional medicine way, would you say?
I would say twofold. One is because we are looking for the cause. So let's say you have eczema, which I treat a lot of kids for. You'd much rather like take dairy out and balance the body with some fish oils and some vitamin D rather than putting steroid cream on a child's skin on a daily basis that then might suppress it. And then later on, they end up with allergies and asthma because you've suppressed the eczema, but you've never dealt with the cause. So I would say that's the big piece. And then the fact that we're trying to bring the body into balance and fix it and not suppress it. And the other big piece is the lack of side effects. So what I see with conventional medicine all the time is great. I have a patient right now who I was speaking to yesterday. So now they've got one medicine that's helping with X, but now they've put on a whole lot of weight because of said medicine. Now they've got a whole different thing that's driving them crazy. Even maybe like their pain is gone, but now they've put on a whole lot of weight. Where natural medicine generally, not to say it's always safe, you have to know which herbs to use, you have to know how to use things, but the side effects are basically minimal. And so I would much rather take a little white ball for the rest of my life that kind of keeps things okay than a medicine that, later on I could end up with like dementia or other things because I've taken this medicine my whole life.
Yeah, I think the thing about treating the cause, not the sort of the symptoms, is really, really interesting, isn't it? How dangerous do you think stress is to our well-being?
It's in the top 5. The way I think of the body and the things that affect us, what causes inflammation and causes problem in our body. It's what we eat. It's our gut health. It's our exposure to toxins, infectious things like viruses, bacteria, and then stress. And honestly, I've had cases where there is nothing else wrong besides the fact that stress is impacting a person's body. I treat a lot of infertility, which is a beautiful but yet such a hard thing to treat because you have amazing success, but you have amazing disappointment that you have to go through with people. And stress is such a big impact on women's health and their ability to get pregnant or not pregnant, heart health, mental health. And, we're living in a world where we're just expected to be on all the time, depending on what profession you're in. But sometimes I get emails from people at 9 p.m. at night, and then I'll get another thing from them at 8 9 the next morning to be like, oh, you haven't replied, I'm on my way to the clinic. I'm like, no, you can't expect me. We all need to have time out. But the world that we live in nowadays is just this expected, like, boom, you're on all the time. You're on email, you're on your phone, and people can just message and do it any time. And I just think that has created a level of stress in people's lives that I don't think we're even beginning to understand the impact that is having.
I believe you work with corporations, don't you? You have something called IMI Corporate. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
What is that?
That was born of the realization that we realized, like, I was sitting and helping all these individuals in my room, but then they were going back to a corporate environment that expected something from them. So they couldn't make some of the changes that would probably be helpful, right? So we kind of thought, and we really need to be taking this to the corporates. And it was actually a patient of mine who works at a law firm who came to me and said, can you come and talk to our women's group? And I was like, sure. And we had already started to develop some talks. And from that talk is I developed what we call the Superwoman Syndrome talk, which I presented for the first time. And it's exactly this. It's like, how do you live in the world that we do right now, but be well and be healthy? And so our mission behind IMI Corporate is to really kind of bring awareness and understanding to the corporations, because the truth of the matter is, if you look at all the research, when you look after people and you let them rest and you do some mindfulness and you give them healthy food, their productivity goes way up, not less, right? But Hong Kong still very much has this old school manner of, I need to work 1 million hours, I need to show face, I need to be there, that's what's going to look good, right? As opposed to valuing the person who, I'm taking 24 hours off, I need to just de-stress, because that person's going to come back the next day and probably have the solution to fix the problem, rather than everyone just sitting there stressing themselves out and not sleeping, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you say that stress is on the rise in the corporate world?
Oh my God, yeah.
Not just because of COVID, yeah? It was on the rise pre-COVID, wasn't it?
This was born before COVID, and then kind of COVID happened. And what I think is so sad too is, especially brilliant women, but the men too, but women, because they've got the kids at home and the stress and everything at work, you lose brilliant people from corporations because of stress. People who can make a difference, who could really shift things on a corporate level. And so many of those people end up leaving. And I think that's so sad. Like, if corporates sort of valued looking after people and allowing them, then they would stay and they could continue to contribute. Like, so many of these amazing people that I treat have just been decided, I'm just going to leave the rat race and go do X and Y, which is great for them. But then we're not changing the dynamic of what exists, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I read on your webpage that you've identified something called the Superwoman Syndrome. Tell me a bit about that.
That is the syndrome where women are so incredibly hard on themselves. It's so interesting treating men and women, because women will always kind of feel they're never doing a good enough job, and men overestimate how well they're doing.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And so with Superwoman Syndrome, it's exactly that. It's these women who are brilliant. They are excelling in the corporate environment. They have their kids, they have their households, they have their friends. They have to keep their weight at a certain point. They need to look good all the time. And then they're still so incredibly hard on themselves as well. And what starts to happen is these women hit burnout, right? So it usually starts with sleep issues to begin with, anxiety all the time. And then you start to see the hormonal effects, which is why I see so much of the infertility and PMS and endometriosis. And then from there, you're going to get some more of the serious things that happen. And that is Superwoman Syndrome, where you're just expected to be brilliant at everything and on all the time. So many, and I'm in the same position, you probably too. When you're a working woman, there's never off, right? You at work, and then when you're home, you're on with your kids. There's never any time. And then what happens is you go to bed later because that's the only time you have out. But then you're cutting, no one can cope long-term on 5 to 6 hours sleep. You're just destroying your health in that process. So this is the kind of vicious cycle that women get into. And so the Superwoman Syndrome is to kind of come in, get people aware of this. And then a lot of the time you can't change things, but there are a lot of wellness hacks and things that you can do to help your body cope better if you can't completely change things. And so that's really what we talk about.
Give me some examples of some of those hacks.
One of the basic ones is sleep. Try and get 8 hours sleep a night. Like, it's such a small thing and you're like, sleep. But like, honestly, that can literally revolutionize. And a lot of the time it's also getting people to sleep better and dealing with stress. meditation, mindfulness. And that doesn't have to be sit down with a whole guided video because people don't always have time for that. Sometimes it's just you're sitting at your desk, stop, look out the window, take 10 deep breaths, do some progressive muscle relaxation up and down. That takes 5 to 6 minutes. And suddenly you're like, your whole sympathetic nervous system has calmed down. Looking at food intolerances, that's a big inflammation. So if you can kind of figure out what you're eating and take those out, then suddenly your energy levels go up, your mood improves. And then there are a lot of the hacks that I use are sort of also getting on good vitamins, B vitamins, magnesium, herbs that really make a difference with the body, help people cope better with stress. So there's so many things that you can do that even if you can't completely change your environment in your day-to-day life, you can do to help you kind of cope better as well.
Okay, so now I'm going to selfishly ask you a question for me.
Sure.
And hopefully many of my listeners have the same problem. But being in menopause, I've struggled with sleep now for like 10 years.
Yes.
And obviously I'm super busy and I have a bit of anxiety, which I'm doing well with meditation to get under control. But I take a lot of sleeping tablets to sleep. And I know that that's affecting my health. I know that it's affecting my weight. And what advice would you have for me to get off sleeping tablets and to be able to manage my sleep better?
It's not an easy one. Sleeping tablets, I would say, are probably one of the hardest things that I've had to do in practice because they do alter brain chemistry. So it makes it a lot more difficult. Like it's one of my pet peeves that they get prescribed so easily without sort of the explanation that these aren't so easy to start.
Tell me how they affect your brain chemistry.
Sleeping tablets, you don't knock out the frontal cortex. So you sleep, but you actually don't have REM and deep sleep on sleeping tablets. So you're not actually having quality sleep. And so when you try to wean off, you've lost sort of the natural ability to sleep. And then some of the neurotransmitters get affected as well, depending on which sleeping pill you're using. So they're a massive pet peeve of mine from that perspective. The first way to deal with a case like yours is obviously not to pull the sleeping pills. The first thing is to get your sleep quality better and to find out what's going on. So it's probably looking at your, what we call your HPA axis, seeing what your cortisol rhythms are doing in the day, see what's happening with your melatonin at night, and first starting to try get all of that piece regulated and getting you on magnesium before bed and good B vitamins. And then usually it's using certain herbs that help the body with more energy and balance during the day, and then starting to bring cortisol levels down at night. And then once you get you to a point where, okay, now I'm having better quality sleep, then starts the withdrawal and the weaning process. And it's a very slow.
Yeah, I'm able to go without them and use melatonin and valerian sometimes. And I do the magnesium and stuff, and that helps. And I can see that. I think it's just sticking with it and recognizing that if you have a terrible night's sleep, you still will be able to function the next day. And then you'll sleep better the next night. So you've got to not panic when you're awake at 2 a.m.
Totally.
And that's the hardest thing. But do you see that it's common with menopausal women that they have sleep problems?
It is. That and sort of the mood changes.
The hot flashes and mood flashes. Yeah.
So part of it is also looking at liver health and also getting on, like I would also use certain herbs that just help the body cope better. Like I use a product called maca pause, which is a really good form of maca, which really makes a big, big difference. St. John's wort is very useful as well with menopausal women to help balance things. So it really would be looking at every angle of why are you not sleeping and then trying to figure it out. But liver health as well. In Chinese medicine, 1 to 3 a.m. is liver time. And when you wake up in that time, a lot of it is a toxin load on the system.
Wow. See, that's so interesting because I'm awake at 3 every day.
So there's definitely something. And then there's certain homeopathic remedies that also use who have that 3 a.m. wake up. And there's lots of things.
It's a lot, isn't it? Yeah. It's not easy.
Some of the basics like do start to work as well.
Yeah. And a lot of what you've suggested I'm already kind of working on. But that was really helpful. Thank you. Now back to the interview. What are some of the programs that you run or the workshops that you run with women specifically?
You mean from a corporate environment or from just a practice environment?
Yeah,
corporate.
Well, I was reading on your website about the corporate women's programs that you run.
That I usually come in and do the Superwoman Syndrome talk. And then from there, I'm able to give individual support depending on what the company wants. I can do kind of sort of individual consults with some of their top executives to kind of work out what might be able to support them. Also look at their environment and kind of give suggestions and things that might help their teams work well. And then as part of IMI Corporate, we also have in-depth talks. So, obviously I'll talk about stress, I'll talk about sleep, I'll talk about digestion being important. But then we have individual talks on all of those sections that kind of take a deep dive into stress, a deep dive into sleep, a deep dive into toxicity, a deep dive into digestion. So we've kind of developed a program, and then mindfulness or mental health, that we can kind of provide a framework really for a corporate, or give people really all the things to kind of think about when you think about your health.
What are some of your key areas of expertise? Like, we've talked about your work in corporates, and we've talked about sort of stress and gut health, but do you have key areas that you kind of focus on, or are you really open to helping anybody with any kind of health issue, individuals and corporate?
As a naturopathic physician, I'm definitely what we considered like similar to a general practitioner, where I can help most things. But my expertise definitely run in infertility, children's health, eczema, allergies, and anxiety in kids, mental health for anxiety and depression, and autoimmune thyroid health area as well. So not to say that I can't treat any other things. Those are the things that I love to treat and that I'm excellent at treating.
So tell me a bit about how you might treat or help work with someone with depression or anxiety or something like that, with mental health issues.
Again, totality. My first visit, I have a 70-minute first visit, right? So I take an incredibly thorough history from, I want to hear about what was happening at age 2 to what's happening now, right? There's none of the 5 minutes I'm sad, give you an antidepressant. And so from that in-depth history, I can usually already start to tell certain patterns. So usually I will always prescribe a homeopathic remedy at a first visit, and probably some of the nutrients that I think will help. With depression cases, I look a lot at food, what they're eating, gut health, and then I do a lot of DNA testing, epigenetic DNA testing, where we find out if someone can methylate well and what their COMT gene is doing, and whether they can detox well, and are they prone to inflammation? Because a lot of people with depression and anxiety have a lot of issues with how their body processes, and with getting them on certain nutrients, you can make a massive difference that way. So it's sort of a whole pronged approach. I mean, homeopathy is beautiful, and homeopathy, if you get the right remedy, you can shift perception of things as well. So with anxiety and depression, a lot of the time is if you can shift the way somebody looks at the world, that starts to shift everything else. And then you give the supportive nutrients, and you look at kind of the deeper stuff, and you put it all together. I mean, vitamin D deficiency causes depression, right? Like sometimes it's not even, in certain cases, it's not massively complicated. It's like, oh, you've got vitamin D deficiency. Oh, you're gluten intolerant. Boom, you take out gluten, and they're like, oh, I feel like a different human being, right? I mean, it's not always that simple. But those are the things that the way I kind of come across where, and I'm not to say that I don't recommend people sometimes get on medication. I'm not anti, I was trained very integrative. Thank God for emergency medicine doctors. Thank God for surgery. Thank God for drugs. Sometimes they save lives. But for me, they're always like, well, if nothing else has helped.
Yes.
Or,
so go the natural route first.
If someone's life quality is so low, and there have been times when I've said to a patient, I really think you need more than what I can do. And then I'll recommend. But I see so much of the flip side, where I see so many people so quickly just come to see their GP, and they're like, oh, they're struggling a little bit, and boom, I'll give you an antidepressant, even before they've sent them to a psychologist just to talk about things. And I'm like, these drugs, studies that show that they might cause dementia later on, they're not like without harm to just quickly put people on. And they also shouldn't be used that for more than 6 months to a year at a time. And yet people are just kind of left on them for years and years and years, right? So I just think it's kind of like, think of the simplest stuff first, always. And then if you have to go the medical route, do that as sort of a last resort.
What sort of work do you do with women to support their hormonal health?
It's a lot of balancing. It's a lot of working out where things are in balance. There's an amazing urine test through the US called the Dutch urine test, where you can actually, you pee throughout the day, and then you kind of see what people's progesterone levels are and what their metabolites are, and estrogen and their metabolites. So you can get a really good picture, because blood just gives you an instant piece. It doesn't really give you anything about how things are metabolized in the body. So that's a big, useful one that I use. And then a lot of it is balancing. So gut health, you wouldn't think like your gut is connected to your hormones, but the things that you're growing in your gut, like certain bacteria can like literally unbind glucuron. So glucuronidation is a process that happens with getting rid of estrogen in the body. If you've got bad bacteria in your gut, they kind of undo that process, and the estrogen, instead of leaving the body, gets reabsorbed. If you've got overgrowth of certain yeasts in the gut, those toxins can bind estrogen receptors and mess with things. So you always have to look at gut health. You've got to look at, again, diet is so important, exercise, hormone imbalance. And then the big thing too with hormones is some people just don't detox hormones well. It's the way you're kind of made. Other people do. And so sometimes it's finding out that genetic information too, because then you kind of know, well, that's your risk, right? And I do a lot of genetic testing on sort of cancer patients post. I don't treat cancer, it's not one in my area, but I helped a lot of people post get healthy. And there's a certain gene that 100% of people who have had breast cancer have this gene because they just don't detox estrogen very well. So again, if you can know that at 15, right? And know that you need to be eating massive amounts of cruciferous veggies a day and getting on certain supplements that can help, you might be preventing yourself getting breast cancer at age 50. So again, it's simple, but sometimes you just get someone, give a bit of magnesium, give some good B vitamins, get a homeopathic remedy, and boom, their hormones are balanced. And sometimes you've got to go deeper diving to see why things are imbalanced.
Wow, that's
I always
so
try
interesting.
simple and then go complex.
Yeah, and then go deeper. Would you recommend those DNA tests where you can see if you've got predispositions to different health issues?
I definitely would, but they're not all created equal. Like there's a company in Hong Kong that advertises a hell of a lot. It's everywhere. Their test is pretty completely useless because they don't give you the raw data, and they have given a whole lot of opinions on things. But the algorithms that they use to kind of make those decisions, I'm like, So like I've had people who've done this test and then I'm like, there's nothing I can do with that. 23andMe is a very popular one. 23andMe, the data they just give you information about your ancestry and your overall health risk. You can use the raw data and put it through certain platforms. So 23andMe is not totally useless, but they don't run all the genes anymore that they used to. Right. So I find there's certain ones that are better. Like we use a company called Nordic Labs. It's actually a lab through South Africa and Scandinavia, which it's a company called DNA Health. It doesn't run trillions of genes, but it runs ones that you can do something about and that are very well researched. So for me, it's like, okay, you can actually do something with this, as opposed to, there's another one that we can do through the US that looks at almost like massive amounts of information of a genome, but that's very overwhelming for a patient to have that much information about themselves. There's some good ones through the UK. So yes, the tests are very useful, but they're not all equally useful. So it's really worth doing your research of which one's going to give
homework,
you.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful information. What advice would you give to people who are struggling with their physical or mental health issues?
The first thing I would say is start with the basics, because also when people are struggling, you can easily overwhelm them. And if you throw too much at someone, they're just like, I can't do this. But you start small. Sleep is such an important one. Drink water. I know that's such a simple thing, but you know how many people just drink coffee and other things and then they just don't drink throughout the day? Like I've seen just people increasing water make a big difference. Stop and breathe. So mindfulness and meditation is so like mindful and meditation, like everyone says it all the time, but yeah, it actually
works, doesn't it? Yeah, it does. I've seen it myself.
It's not complicated. You don't do a class. You don't have to like devote hours to it a day. You know, you've got all these apps that make it easily. I'm a big fan of yoga nidras, which you can go on YouTube and do a yoga nidra, which are beautiful. So that's your place to start. And exercise, another underrated, ignored thing that has a massive effect on health and mental health as well. And then the simple things with diet. Yes, you could go more complicated, but what are the simple things? Don't eat fried food. Try not to eat processed food. Eat a lot of veggies. Cut sugar. I'm very anti-sugar. I'm like, there's no good in sugar whatsoever. And white foods. Honestly, diet change can make a difference to mental health and overall well-being. So you start with the basics, and then it's amazing with just getting those sorted, how much can get better. And then obviously you've got to go more complex for the next steps.
Oh, thank you for that. I feel really inspired, actually. After talking to you, I want to go out and make a few changes. That's really, really wonderful. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Benita, how can my listeners find you?
I practice at IMI in Central. So if you go to imi.com.hk, and then on that is also information about the corporate program. Yeah, I'm available for kind of consults, though I am living in Thailand at the moment, so I'm working purely on Zoom. But the hope is I will eventually be able to commute back and forth. And then at the moment also with corporates, we do a lot of webinars and things like that as well. So that's where I find me. We've got amazing dispensary. If people who haven't been to IMI, we have amazing dispensary on Stanley Street in Central where we bring all our products from the US and Australia and the UK. We choose everything. We bring in the best that's available kind of in the world quality-wise.
Yeah, I've been in there. It's amazing. It really is. You've got some great products in there. It's really fabulous. I'll put links to how people can find you and IMI in my show notes.
Great,
thank you. Get in touch with you or to go into IMI. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. That was really, really inspirational. And I am going to make some changes based on some of the things. Thank you for my own private little sleep consultation.
My pleasure.
It's absolutely brilliant. So thanks a lot, Benita, for coming on the show. And it's been really lovely to talk to you. And yeah, I think I might be connecting with you later.
Great. And thank you so much for having me as well.
No worries. So for my listeners out there, if this is something that you've found useful or you've got friends or family who you think would benefit from learning more about Benita and her work as a naturopath, then please can you share this podcast with them? And if you can go to iTunes to rate and review us, that would be brilliant. It will help get me up the iTunes charts, and it will help people find Benita and IMI and just find out more about natural medicine and functional medicine, which is really, really helpful. So thanks a lot, Benita. Really lovely talking to you.
And you. Cheers.
Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.